This is the Friday, April 24th, 2015 version of the Market Plus segment. Joining us now is Dan Hueber. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, we do have a question from Phil in Ontario, submitted via Twitter. Phil is curious, as we look at this El Nino, and you mentioned it briefly on the show, Phil's question is, does El Nino in 2015 mean hot and wet for the U.S. Midwest with night temps over 80, and could it all be noise?
You know, I think noise is probably the better part of the answer there. It's and granted, El Nino events are huge. They're worldwide events. They affect a lot of areas. Can you sit back and say there is this absolute definite correlation between an El Nino and what happens with U.S. crops? And the answer is probably no. It's a little bit fuzzy at best. If anything, there is a strong correlation or stronger correlation towards good U.S. crops and El Nino. We tend to have maybe a little drier winters during El Nino years. Now, that said, there is a very strong correlation, depending on how long that El Nino lasts into the year, between a large El Nino event and issues with drought in Australia and monsoon failures in India. So now, for example, this last week, or 2 weeks ago, I think, the Australian Meteorological Bureau confirmed, we believe this is an El Nino, that it could last into June. Now, that could heighten the probability of drought in Australia our fall, their spring, of course, spring and summer. So, that's one of the reasons I think this wheat market is probably going to find value again. Yes, we have a comfortable supply of wheat, but if you end up with one of the major producers of the world missing a good production year, then that balance changes pretty rapidly.
Yeah, drought in Australia would be a pretty big impact on wheat, and probably the dairy market be the other one that could see a...
Oh, sure. But of course, let's not leave India out, because if India does miss out on the monsoons, does not produce a big wheat crop, and yes, they've turned into a great agricultural country, but here again too, with over 1 billion people there, they don't want to see any crop failures either.
Certainly. And that's one of those things that I think from a big picture in ag, as you look at the growing population and so on. Now you travel quite a bit and talk to people about different issues. What do you see changing away from the markets, big picture-wise? Anything interesting?
And it's certainly outside of the borders of this country, or at least at a different level, not so much even necessarily at the farm level or the consumer level, but I attended a conference last week in Washington directly emphasizing the changes, the needs in feeding the world population. And really that conversation has shifted from one of quantity. I think everybody understands that, yes, we can produce the quantities. In 2008, there were some touch and go issues, but as a whole, the green revolution took care of the production. We can produce great crops in many places in the world now. The big question now is, can we produce nutritional crops? And I think, and granted, there was maybe a heavy representation of the science field, but also a lot of representation from underdeveloped countries, knowing what they need to do to bring better nutrition to their people. And I think wholeheartedly you're seeing that side of the business embrace genetically modified products, because not so much for the BT corn or something of that nature, but certainly the golden rice, which has of course been out there for years and unavailable or unaccepted in many nations, even though the change, the dramatic changes it could make in the nutrition. But for corn, for any of the products where we could start adding micronutrients in there that can be then directly into the diets of those people, I think that it was a very positive sounding message from that group that, yes, the rest of the world is really coming around slowly, that the GMO is not this thing to be feared.
You bet. And it's interesting, as the modifications, as the biotechnology allows us to make more consumer-focused products, maybe that's helping the cause.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, as we're talking international markets, one of the stories we've been talking about week after week on Market to Market is this high U.S. dollar, high, 7, 8, 10, 11-year highs. We've got a question here from Clare City, South Dakota. What is, or is there, a long-term effect on the U.S. dollar in the commodity markets?
The answer, of course, most certainly is yes. There is an impact, not as direct as maybe we like to think sometimes. Psychologically, always an impact. If we see, you can take a plot of the CRB index that you always refer to at the beginning of the show, plot it against the grain prices, and they're going to be an inverse relationship. Now, that said, On any specific commodity, if there is demand for corn, for example, they're not going to look at it and say, gee, the dollar's too high, I'm not going to buy corn. They're going to continue to buy the corn they need. But if there is competition around the world, Ukraine, a great example right now, who has been a very strong competitor in the corn market, certainly their corn is more competitively priced than ours. They're going to go there first. They don't have the quantity we do, but of course what that turns us into is the residual supplier. So it's they come to us after everybody else has been exhausted, or the logistics work out better for somewhere else.
Now, you mentioned Ukraine. The Ukrainian currency took a substantial nosedive here about a month ago, and what has it done since then?
I think it's stabilized just a little bit, as with the Russian ruble has actually turned around and rallied just a little bit. But there's one of the ironies of what happened there now, and you can find both sides of the story. Because of that rise in the Ukrainian currency and in the Russian currency, their domestic prices for corn, wheat, whatever the crops they raise, were at record levels. Now, one side of the coin, you could say, well, that really is going to encourage production, and they've gone in with pretty good conditions on the spring crops this year. Now, the other side of the coin is that also meant record cost on the inputs. Fertilizer prices, all of the inputs were also inflated dramatically. So, you could have seen a potential cutback in some of those uses. Does that mean they're going to, really embrace production this year? Maybe not so much. I think
it might be a wash.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, before we let you go, your thoughts on the dollar as we've seen it pull back here in the past week or so. Think it's going to continue?
I think it's probably reached a temporary high at least. Not that we're going to see a washout, but you could see it pull back 5 or maybe 6 cents on the index. But the reality of it is that where else can anybody go? I mean, we are still the strongest economy in the world. You have just enough issues and problems with other nations, and be it terrorism or be it the slowdown in the Chinese economy. You really can't use the Chinese currency as a world currency to begin with. So, I mean, realistically, we're the only game in town, and I think it's sure after a little washout they'll be back in the dollar, and I don't think we've seen the ultimate high yet.
That was my next question. Do you have an idea on when the Fed might raise rates? Do you have a Dan Hueber best guess?
And of course, all you can do is rely on the forward guidance they continue to give us. It will be, I think, at best late in 2015. I mean, we'll see, of course, as the data comes out month by month, but I think there's a lot of people thinking it could be pushed all the way to 2016 at this point.
Sure. Well, you talk about that forward guidance. If we watched that, the rates would have gone up 3 years ago.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this week.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for sending in your questions via Facebook and Twitter. Please continue to do so and tell all of your friends. Thanks for watching and have a great week.